Well, just when you thought that America had some of the strangest politics in the world, our friends in South Korea say, hold my soju, and then pull off what is like a kinda-coup that maybe lasted like a day or so. But here's the question, like, why is what is going on in South Carolina relevant to what is going on here within the United States? And one of the things I think we need to understand, right, is that in South Korea, they actually have their own pretty major woke movement that has been taking place. And there was a big rejection of this woke movement in the last election cycle. So even though South Korea, different country, different culture in many different respects, a lot of the things that were going on there, my bad, a lot of things that were going on there are things that we're seeing happening within the United States as well. In fact, when you saw all those people kind of flipping out about Trump winning and shaving their head and saying, we're going to join the 4B movement, that was a reference to a movement that has already been going on in South Korea and has actually caused their birth rates to decline to less than one live birth per woman in South Korea, which is devastating for their overall population. So the reason why this is interesting is that you have this election, and all of a sudden, young men revolt in South Korea, vote overwhelmingly for the right-wing candidate. He comes into office, and all of a sudden, you have this huge battle with the establishment and with this new right-wing president. And there's this whole history of things that were going on with lawfare and corruption. And lo and behold, the empire strikes back, right? The woke establishment, the bureaucracy, their parliament, all push back, and he actually calls in the military for a brief period of time. And now we're going to discuss what led up to this, why it's relevant to us, and what we think is potentially going to happen. Because the more we can understand about how things like this are playing out, how the left is responding in other places, it might give us some indication of what could potentially happen here. So we're going to analyze all that. What's similar, what's different, and hopefully give us a good picture of what's going on in South Korea. And again, perhaps help us prepare for things that could happen here in the United States. But before we dive even deeper into all of that, it's time to talk about True Classic. Because look, guys, Christmas is coming up and you need to start doing Christmas shopping. Now, ladies, here's what I'm going to tell you. I wasn't the first one to find True Classic in our family. It was my beautiful bride, Tina, that decided I needed to be wearing something that fit a little bit better than the average t-shirt that I would go buy at a box store somewhere. So she orders me these classic tees from True Classic. And I'm like, these things are awesome. I absolutely love them. I love them for the gym. I love wearing them around. They're great. And then all of a sudden, True Classic comes up with like widely expanded clothing line. I love their button-down shirts. They feel good. They fit right. They got jeans. They got shorts. They got workout gear. They got all of it. So go to trueclassic.com/Nick, right, and buy one of those bundles. And I'm telling you, ladies, if you're looking for, I know everyone talks about getting clothes on Christmas, but we don't know how to dress ourselves, right? So go out there, get one of these for the man in your life, and I'm telling you, you're gonna love what they have. Plus, they have a wide swath for everybody. So go on there, True Classic, check it out, trueclassic.com/Nick. That's where you go. Anyways, let's go ahead and get into what is going on in South Korea. So Christian, I was watching a lot of stuff that was going on about this. We had actually done a whole episode where we were talking about election results in places like Argentina, places like Korea. And one of the things that we were talking about is you've done a lot of work on this thing that you've described as donut theory, talking about what has been going on in urban areas, what's been going on in suburbs, what's going on in rural areas. We've also talked a lot about we discussed the difference that's taking place with respect to how young women are voting and how young men are voting. And South Korea is probably the epicenter of it. It's got to be. In fact, I think it is. It is the biggest difference between the political ideologies, stated political ideologies of young men and young women are like just mind-blowingly opposite. And so we observed this major revolt where it was a city. It was an urban center that gave the conservative party in South Korea the win. And now we're watching the blowback. So let's talk a little bit first about kind of like just a brief overview of kind of what's been going on.
Okay, so for those that weren't there for that episode that we did many months ago, it might have even been almost a year ago, what happened in South Korea over the past probably decade or so politically, in many respects, is actually like a sign of what was to happen to the United States. So we were talking about how the suburbs were getting bluer, urban centers were getting redder. Obviously rural countryside tends to be fairly conservative. We were also talking about the divide between men and women, but particularly young men and women. So, like millennials and Zoomers. And when I say millennials, I don't mean the 40-something-year-old millennials. I mean like me as a millennial. And when you look at those things, what happened in this election here in the US in 2024, where it was like young men broke heavily for Trump, urban centers didn't break for Trump. It's just that they got much redder, right? New York City, Philadelphia, Detroit, Milwaukee, like a lot of these places got, in some cases, significantly redder, even though he still lost all of these cities.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that you had a gender divide within younger voters and urban centers getting redder at the same time that some suburbs, for example, the Richmond suburbs here in Virginia, got bluer at the same time that Northern Virginia got redder, that was a surprise to many people. But if you were listening to this podcast, you already knew that this wasn't just going to happen in the United States. This is actually a global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so the example that we're going to use, especially for today's episode, is this is the 2022 presidential election that took place in South Korea. And we'll walk the audience through exactly what happened over the last about decade or so in South Korean politics.
Can we say this right up front, too? We are going to get pronunciations wrong throughout this episode. We are really trying, again, we're trying to be respectful. So please, nobody misinterpret our inability to pronounce something or again, it's not intentional.
Yeah, we're already off on a bad start. Nick called it South Carolina.
I couldn't believe that. Yeah, the South Carolina.
I was like sitting over here, like pulling the mic over.
Well, it was funny because I said it. I got to talking so quick, and then all of a sudden I see Christian pull the mic over really quick. I'm like, I bet I said South Carolina, so I switched to South Korea. But yeah.
I was about to be like, I was just in South Carolina like a week ago for Thanksgiving.
Yeah. I'm talking about a different coup, one you guys don't even know about.
So long story short, let's take a look at the South Korean presidential election that previously took place in 2022. This is the last presidential election that the country held. They might be holding another one in like 60 to 90 days, but they're supposed to hold their next one in 2027. So here's the results by municipality in South Korea. I've got the map pulled up here. And notice how, by the way, their coloring scheme actually mirrors our coloring scheme. Blue is for the left-wing party. Red is for the more right-wing party. South Korea is one of the only countries in the world that follows the U.S.'s political coloring scheme. Now, one thing that you're going to see that like catches your eye immediately is what on earth is going on here in Southwest Korea.
Yeah.
So this is mostly rural, heavily left wing. Like you're talking margins that are like 80%, in some cases 90%. The reason for this is because this part of the country was actually home to the pro-democracy protests back in the 1970s and 80s that ultimately toppled the military dictatorship. So there's been this long left liberal tradition of being against the more right-wing forces. The military dictatorship in the 80s is broadly considered to have been economically or ideologically right-wing. And so there's this tradition basically that, well, we're pro-democracy, and so, we're going to vote for the left-wing parties because we remembered what happened here in the 1980s when the military cracked down on us. But the other place that you see that's blue on this map is the ring around Seoul, the suburbs around the capital, where Seoul is a huge city.
Oh,
right?
Gosh, yeah.
Like one of the largest cities in the world.
I've been to Seoul, and it is just massive and heavily. It's a cool city, but it is massive. In fact, let me just go ahead.
So you see this this ring of all the municipalities around Seoul that are heavily voting for the left-wing party. But notice what's happening in Seoul itself. You see this? I mean, it is literally, it's a ring around Seoul, and you have this red core. That's downtown Seoul.
That's crazy.
That's the Korean capital.
Yeah, imagine, this is like looking at kind of the overall area of New York, and Manhattan being the deep red portion of it, or the Bronx or something like that. Like you just
nowadays it'd be the Bronx.
Yeah.
The funny thing is the Bronx are actually to the right of Manhattan, which is unthinkable from a generation ago as a Republican. You'd lose both of them, right? But traditionally Republicans would do better in Manhattan than the Bronx. But Trump has just upended so many things. But what's so fascinating about this map is that you see that the vast majority of South Korea in terms of landmass, most of this is rural, right? I mean, you get to the western parts of the country, and it's mostly rural.
You've got Busan in the south, which is another
Busan's
larger urban
very
area.
conservative.
Yeah.
Although Incheon is not.
Yeah.
That's the main port city that we actually landed at during the Korean War. But what's fascinating is that the conservative coalition is mostly rural in the western and southern parts of the country, with two exceptions being the city of Busan, which is the second largest city, and the capital itself.
Yeah.
And then the left-wing party is obviously historically dominant in the part of the country that ideologically
The Southwest.
votes the way that it does because of the legacy of the military dictatorship. But then their other core base is everything around Seoul. It's the suburbs around it. Now, we'll talk a little bit about the candidates and who's coming in and who might be coming out and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that's just at the stage in terms of the geography. Now, the results of this election were that Yoon Suk-yeol ended up becoming the president of South Korea. He was the nominee of the People's Power Party, which is usually considered the right-wing party in Korean politics. Now, in Korean politics, some parties dissolve and some parties pop up from time to time. They don't have a stable, permanent system where it's like in the U.S., we've had the Democrats and the Republicans since before the Civil War. In South Korea, they usually have a two-party system. There are minor parties that sometimes win seats in their legislature, but every now and then you get a party that will implode, usually because of something like a scandal or some sort of ideological split, but it'll usually be replaced then by another party that will fill that vacuum.
Yeah.
And so the PPP is currently the stand-in for the right-wing party. But yeah, they narrowly won in 2022, and many people didn't think that they could. And the reason why is because Seoul came in, and the people in Seoul, in particular, young men in Seoul, were the reasons that they came in. So the last thing I'll say before
I want to say, like, the craziest part of the numbers in that election was, I think, the most voting loyal demographics for the conservatives were young men and older women.
Here's the breakdown by gender. So remember, red, right, blue, left. 18 to 29-year-old men, 36 to almost 59 for the right-wing candidate in 2022. And then look at the divide with young women. It was the exact opposite, 58 to 33, almost 34.
Yeah.
And the gender divide here is just intense.
And then older, both older men and women, but especially like older women. If you were 6 years or older in Korea and a female, you voted for the conservative by close to 70 or about 67%.
Yes.
So yeah, that's an interesting coalition.
And what you end up seeing as well is that middle-aged voters that are like in their 40s and 50s, they overwhelmingly voted for the left wing because that was the generation that campaigned for the return to democracy, or should I say, to the embracement of democracy in South Korea back in the 1980s. They were the ones that were like, high school students and college students that basically overthrew the military dictatorship in 1988.
Yeah.
It wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things that South Korea was a military dictatorship. People forget this. We actually did a Y-Minute on this topic where South Korea had embraced free markets for a very long time, since the end of the Korean War. But South Korea was more or less run by the military without any sort of outside, voting of any sort of, I mean, you had like a veneer of democracy, but it wasn't really.
The other thing to remember is like South Korea was in a very unique position, right? They very nearly lost post World War II. They very nearly lost the country until the United States intervened with significant troops. They came back, pushed and almost took the entire Korean peninsula. Then the Chinese army got involved, pushed everyone down beneath the 38th parallel, and had something of a stalemate. And now you still have, technically, they're still at war. But obviously you haven't seen like it as open conflict for decades now. But it's the reason why South Korea is in such a unique position is because China is considered an enemy, North Korea is considered an enemy, and in many respects within South Korean culture, even though Japan you would think theoretically, since it's a strong U.S. ally and since it obviously takes a strong position against communism, you'd think there'd be allies there. There was a very, very brutal colonial period where Japan had occupied and was essentially administering Korea, and it was there's been multiple invasions of Japan with Korea over time, but so there's something of a very, very brutal history that took place there, and I kind of got to see some of that firsthand. I actually did some missionary work, and we didn't go to South Korea. We're going to Okinawa, but we had some people that were South Korean that they had like it was a struggle for them to work with the Japanese, and because for many of them they grew up with stories from their grandparents or their parents and World War II. So
Japan colonized Korea in
so
the early 20th century.
It's important to understand that if you're South Korea, right, obviously the United States has been the guarantor of your security for a long time, because it's not just a question of South Korea versus North Korea. I will tell you right now, you can look at North Korea's military all day. The South Korean military and economy is significantly more power than the North Korean one. The biggest thing South Korea's facing right now is the declining birth rate is, I believe, the worst in the world of any major nation.
Oh, speaking of that, actually, we'll get on this topic already. So here's their birth rate, or here's their demographic chart right now.
Yeah,
it looks like a diamond.
Can you explain for the viewers and the listeners what exactly all of this means?
So a typical population pyramid would be more either triangular or rectangular shaped.
Yeah.
So, for example, actually, if you give me just a second, I will pull up the U.S.'s demographic pyramid, okay?
Yeah.
Here is the population pyramid of the United States, and I'll explain this for our audio listeners. It's more rectangular shaped, as you can see. Now, it turns into a cone at the top, obviously, because you have people in their 80s and 90s that die off. But the United States does have a birth rate problem.
Yeah.
We offset it with immigration, which has turned into a big issue, obviously, in the U.S. We all know that. Our listeners of the podcast understand that. But overall, the demographics of the United States are much healthier than many countries around the world. Now, if we didn't accept any immigration, which again, this is a big issue, but if we didn't accept any immigration, we would be shrinking right now, like most of the developed world. But we would be shrinking very slowly. For example, it would take us until the end of the century for us to be at about 250 to 280 million people from 330 million right now. And so even if we had no immigration for, 80 years or whatever, the U.S. would still have a larger population than it was like when Nick was born.
Yeah, 2.1 live births per woman is considered replacement rate for any nation. So that's like if your nation is 300 million and you have a 2.1 live births per woman, that's considered you're going to sustain at about 300,000 or 300 million. And
when you look at like under 10-year-olds, right, or under 5-year-olds, the most recent generation that's being born, these aren't even Zoomers at this point. This is like Gen Alpha, right? These are the type of kids that, like, if Hamilton and I got married, that would be the generation they'd be born into, right? They're, again, it's fallen off a little bit compared to where, like my generation is, right? But overall, you can see that our population pyramid is fairly healthy. Now, when you look at South Korea here, again, and I'll try to explain this for our audio listeners.
Wow.
This is the death of a country.
The cone's basically going the wrong direction.
Well, and this is the other thing, too, that like Elon Musk has taught. When Elon Musk first, posited the idea very publicly that the biggest thing facing us was not climate change, it was not terrorism, it was population collapse, they all laughed at him. And what I don't think people properly understand is that, yes, your population can grow exponentially if you have high birth rates, but if you have low birth rate, it drops exponentially. Like this is a zero-sum game here. And
this is what it looked like in the 60s, in 1960. This is South Korea. But I mean, they were still a developing country.
It was like a pyramid.
They were very poor. They had just recovered at this point from the catastrophe of a world war and then the Korean War immediately after that.
Yeah.
Right. We talked about how earlier the Japanese had occupied Korea for a whole generation at the start of the 20th century. But their pyramid was a little triangle in 1960.
Yeah.
And then their birth rate just imploded. Here's what it looked like in 1970. And by 1970, South Korea was starting to turn into a booming economy. It was in the early 70s that South Korea eclipsed North Korea in terms of economic output.
I mean, you could even see the population there shrinking. I love the graphic that actually is a video that plays and shows you it shrinking over time.
Yeah.
Yeah, here it is from 1960 to 2020. And you can see
it
was
when it
healthy
contracts.
for a long time, though.
Yeah.
It was healthy for a long time, and you see that in the late 80s it starts to contract, and then in the early 2000s it starts to implode, and then by the 2010s and 2020s it turns into it's like the slippery slope, right? Where it's like the curve turns into it's just a straight cliff that you fall off.
I think people also kind of underestimate the regional and economic impact that South Korea also represents. South Korea is something of a miracle. And it is easily the best juxtaposed between relatively free markets versus communist or centrally planned economies, because you essentially have two people or of the same ethnicity, same history, everything else, and then all of a sudden you draw a line right through the middle of the country. Okay, one of you has, again, relatively free market economics by comparison. The other is communism. And the differences are just over the last several decades are exponential.
And this is one of the reasons why the 4B movement is so catastrophic in Korea. It's this idea that women don't want to have the babies, and women. Christian always says this: women are a limiting resource, right?
Well, but
Yes.
I need to finish. I need to finish this thought on the overall importance of South Korea. Because not only was South Korea this incredible demonstration of what happens when you actually allow an incredibly war-torn country surrounded by enemies, right? The ability to flourish. They have about 51 million people in Korea right now. That number is going to drop significantly over the next several decades. Their economy is almost the same size as Russia's. Like, I don't think people properly recognize that this little country on the tip of the South Korean peninsula with very, very few natural resources has an economy of roughly 1.7 trillion. Russia's is about 2 trillion. So massive Russia with 3 times the population of South Korea barely has a larger economy than South Korea. It is, I mean, it's an economic miracle. I've actually spent some time in South Korea, and it really is an incredible country. But it's just amazing how it's almost like it has voluntarily, and it's from the left, it has voluntarily chosen suicide.
But I think that one of the things that causes something like this to happen is when the society places more value on monetary success and working, and careers. Careers are literally just, that's the biggest thing you can hope to do in your life, is to have a career that pays a lot of money. And that's for men and women. And at that point, when you place so much value on money and having, a lot of resources, extra resources, not like nobody wants to just subsist. They want a lot of money. And to have a lot of money, you've got to have both people working. And women are also expected to be able to support themselves now, and not to be taken care of for the work that they do, that only they can do, and that's to have children.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I think
no one else can have kids, and so it's when women are now working through all of their most fertile years, and a lot of women don't even want to have children now in that environment. It's all about working. And so I think the problem is because has become an economic powerhouse. That's also part of the problem. It's almost like an overcorrection, it's almost there's fear poverty so much that they will forego the children and the posterity. They forgo all of that in order to have more money and more resources, and it's going to end up working against them after a while.
The thing you also, I think that's spot on. The thing you also see in Japan, because Japan also has really low birth rates and is facing issues as well. You also saw a lot of these countries, they didn't just like legalize abortion or birth control, and in many respects, their governments actively pushed for it. And so what you see in some of these, again, what you would call highly developed nations, is you saw this push away from what you might call kind of like traditional, values around family and religion. There was a high emphasis on economics, which again, I want people to be economically successful, but there was this push on trying to control what they saw as significant population growth that was going to outpace resources. And remember that at the same time, you had a lot of these Malthusians, because, and for those of you, when I talk about Malthusians, probably the biggest Malthusian within the 70s was Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. And what all of these, and they were all left wing. They were almost all left wing. They were all predicting that because of like these massive increase in population within the early 20th century, in leading up, and then you saw this massive population increase post-war in Korea and Japan and areas like that. It was, you're going to run out of resources. Now, if you're South Korea and Japan, you're especially worried about this because you don't have a lot of natural resources, right? You're having to import food. And so this resonated with a lot of these governments who said, well, we've got to get our populations under control. And the way that we're going to do that is by heavily encouraging abortion, heavily encouraging birth control. And there was an entire culture that came in with that. It wasn't just, okay, this is an issue that we have with respect to the spreadsheets and numbers and resources available. Not to mention the fact that Paul Ehrlich was wrong on everything he predicted. This guy is still like a tenured professor that people actually listen to. This guy has been repeatedly wrong for decades, but it doesn't matter because it wasn't about the science. It was about this culture that came in that had a lot of animosity toward the traditional family. And it utilized things, whether it was women's rights or women's independence or what. And again, there was some positive elements to this, right? There was genuine issues that needed to be addressed, but you had this entire ideological movement that came in and jumped on any issue that was allowing them to consolidate political power. So if it was, okay, women's rights, and the way we're going to address women's rights is through abortion, birth control, and getting rid of the traditional family. Because let's look at this from a historical perspective. One of the reasons why Karl Marx and the left have had real problems with the traditional family is because it stands in the way of greater state control. Then you look at the green energy or just the green movement in general, right? There was an interesting book written that basically said it was watermelon. It's green on the outside, red in the center, and what they meant is that it's Marxist in the center. They're just the whole environmental thing has just become the latest cause celeb for pushing greater central planning and greater government control. Even though when you looked at communist economies, they're horrible to the environment, absolutely horrible to the environment. It didn't matter. That was the narrative. And so what have we seen now over decades? And in a place like South Korea, it really became a part of public policy, not just their university system, where now all of a sudden you've raised a generation of women where it's not just, I want to go get a job and I want to be successful. It is open animosity and hostility toward the family, toward having kids. And that's the part that I think we really need to grasp here. This is not just simply, okay, are we dealing with overpopulation that's going to have a tough time on resources? Or are we trying to provide more economic opportunities for women who want to work outside the home? That was not all we got. We got a whole ideology and culture that went with it that is now manifesting itself in an open hostility toward women who do want to be mothers, who do want to manage the home. You saw it with Simone de Beauvoir, one of the French feminists. She said in a debate in the 70s, women should not be allowed to choose to be wives and mothers because if they have the choice, too many of them will pick it. Well, the 4B movement in South Korea, we're kind of seeing the I don't know if you want to call it the epicenter of what happens when the female population fully embraces this, and it is a significant portion of the female population within South Korea.
Yes.
You can see in there, I'm sorry, go ahead, Christian.
Oh, I was just about to say, well, okay, I was actually about to push us a little bit further along. And,
yeah, please do.
What we wanted to cover here, because we still have a lot of, I mean, look, there's a whole coup that we still have to cover.
Yeah, we haven't gotten to the coup yet. Well, but I do
we're already 30 minutes in and we haven't gotten to the coup
But I
yet.
do think it's important to lay the groundwork because so many analysts are coming in now and they're making this all about a legal issue that took place or a parliamentary issue that took place. It's like, you got to understand that there is a cultural component
It's
to
permeating through the entire culture. What I was going to say is that if you watch K-drama at all, you will find out what they really think of men. And they see men as sniveling mama's boys who don't want to work. And it's worse. I feel like the way they portray men there is worse than how Hollywood portrays men here. If you've ever watched K-drama, you know what I'm talking about.
All right, Christian.
Okay, so I've got a list of recent presidents of South Korea pulled up here. We have a bunch of links to go through. Many of them we're just going to be going through the headline. But here's something interesting. We'll just click through each one and I'll point out a couple things here. So let's go back to the previous president that served over 20 years ago, from 2003 to 2008. Take a look what happened to him. After leaving office, Roh returned to his hometown. He ran a duck farm. He also ran a website promoting democracy. 14 months later, he was arrested on suspicion of bribery by prosecutors. Subsequent investigations attracted public attention. He committed suicide in 2009.
Wow.
He was a more left of center president, but yeah, he was the first one that was born after the Japanese occupation of Japan ended in 1945. His successor, his initials are, he's known by his initials MB. I'm going to butcher so many names, so I'm going to try to avoid reading off names when possible. His successor that took office in 2008 until 2013. In 2018, he was arrested on charges of bribery, embezzlement, and tax evasion, alleging to have occurred during his presidency. Prosecutors accused Lee of receiving bribes totaling 11 billion won and channeling assets of 35 billion won to an illicit slush fund. Shortly before his arrest, he had a handwritten statement on Facebook denying the charges. His arrest occurred roughly a year after the arrest of former President Park Geun-hye. She was the daughter of the famous military dictator that was assassinated in the 1970s in South Korea. He has a very controversial legacy. The best way that I could probably describe Park's regime is that he is in some ways the Korean version of Franco. Very right-wing, very polarizing figure, obviously. He's ruthlessly criticized from the left for running a military dictatorship. On the right, they defend him because he is the man that basically made Korea. He is the person that took Korea from being a impoverished agrarian backwater country to a modern first world thriving economy, even though he has a controversial legacy of being a military dictatorship. Well, his daughter ended up becoming president many years later, and we're going to get to her in just a second.
Yeah, that gets interesting.
He also goes to prison, right? He was convicted in 2018 on a 15-year prison sentence. He was eventually released because he was granted a pardon. So we're what now? 3 for 3 here, or 2 for 2. We're about to go 3 for 3.
Yeah.
So now we get to her. Like I said earlier, she's the daughter of a former, military dictator in South Korea. She was elected in 2012. She was impeached from office, actually. She was not in office for her entire term. In December 2016, she was impeached by the National Assembly on charges related to influence peddling by her top aide. The prime minister assumed powers, acting as president. The Constitutional Court upheld the impeachment by a unanimous 8-0 ruling, removing her from office. And then she was sentenced to 24 years in prison. She was eventually pardoned by her ideological polar opposite of a successor once the left wing, the liberals came back into power. She's obviously on the right. Her family historically has been very prominent within right wing politics in South Korea. She was popular at first until her career just imploded because of a scandal that resulted in her going to prison.
Mm-hmm.
And she spent several years in prison until she was pardoned. And so then she was replaced with Moon Jae-in. And Trump
I ask a
does
question?
not like this man at all.
Can I ask a question? Since it seems like there's a pattern here, is this lawfare, or did these people really do this? Do we
Yes.
know?
Yes.
It's lawfare and
No,
they did it?
It's yes. It's like it's one of those things where there's a yes is the best answer to both questions. I think there is a lot of corruption that is actually taking place and influence peddling, but there's also a lot of manipulation of the legal system based off of partisanship.
So South Korea is another example of the United States in the future, or in some cases the present, because what both sides have understood in South Korea is in some ways that democracy is a game that can be hacked. And if you leverage the court system and lawfare in order to explicitly target and weaponize the judicial system against your political enemies, you can sometimes sometimes repeal the results of a presidential election and then get your guy in. Because in South Korea, there must be a new presidential election held if the president resigns or is impeached or removed from office. And so, again, going back to this list here, so you had more right-wing candidates. These were members of the Liberty Party of Korea, which then imploded under Park's administration because of the scandal, and then was replaced with the People Power Party, which is now the spiritual successor of the Liberty Party.
Yeah.
Well, you had 2 back-to-back right-wing candidates right after the 2008 financial crisis that came in, right? Well, she ends up getting impeached and removed from office, which then triggers a new election. which is then won by the left-wing candidate from the Democratic Party. It's kind of interesting how in South Korea, their left-wing party is also called the Democratic Party, and they also use blue.
Yeah.
So that'll be easy for us to remember. But Moon Jae-in, very left-wing guy. Donald Trump hates this man with a burning passion. Under his administration, relations with Korea imploded to their worst level since World War II. The two countries were engaged in a brutal trade war. In fact, actually, let me just throw this up here just real quick.
How much of this do you think was partially because of President Trump meeting with North Korea?
And no, actually, the reason that he met with North Korea
they
was
weren't angry about that.
To give you an idea of how bad the relationship was between the United States and South Korea under his administration, who succeeded Park's administration after she was impeached from office. Again, he's on the left. In fact, actually, let's pull up the special election that was held. So it was a shattered, group of people that were running. There was multiple different parties, but I mean, he won kind of in a landslide in this special election, right? The relationship was so bad with Japan and the United States under his administration that Donald Trump preferred meeting with Kim Jong-un over him. There's a reason that Trump did what he did in what was it, 2017 and 2018, especially 2018, when he was going to Asia. He would meet with Abe in Japan, who was the prime minister.
Yeah.
He had a very close working
with
relationship with him. They got along swimmingly. And actually, Nick and I have talked about this a little bit, that Abe, from our perspective, is very controversial because he was a huge money printing guy. He loved manipulating the monetary policy, but he's very popular with other conservatives because Abe's a hardcore nationalist, or he was a strong social conservative, and he was very, very, very pro-Trump. Well, Trump had a great relationship with Japan's government, and Trump, for a while, had a good relationship with the North Koreans. He had a better, this is not an exaggeration, he had a better relationship with the North Koreans than he did with the South Koreans under Moon's, administration that replaced Parks after she was impeached and then thrown in prison. And part of the reason why is because the Democratic Party is in Korea is very left-wing progressive on social and economic issues. And they want to pivot back towards basically being friendly with the North Koreans and the Chinese and pursuing a more hostile policy towards
the United States and Japan.
And this has led to huge implications to their economy, to foreign policy, because, think about the implications that this has when it comes to trade policy, when it comes to the DMZ, when it comes to, potential Korean reunification, when it comes to Korea's relationship with the People's Republic of China. And so when you get one party that comes in that says, we want to pivot to Beijing and Pyongyang, and then you have another party that comes in that says, we want to pivot to Washington and Tokyo, those are mutually exclusive policies in many respects. And so South Korea can wildly pivot back and forth between these two. And so after Moon left office, and I have a bunch of links up here that I'll just run through to give an idea of what's happening. So this is from this was an essay that I read.
Just give us the once over the world on that.
Basically about Park's impeachment in 2017. Many observers wonder if Korea's young democracy has succumbed to populist forces, lapsing into deinstitutionalization. And so what this paper was basically talking about is that these institutions that were, this is an issue that we've talked about in the U.S., these institutions that were set up after democratization in the 1980s that are supposed to set a neutral playing field are starting to no longer be neutral. Where have we seen that before?
Yeah. Well, and let me roll that back here for a second, because again, it's important to understand that, again, Korea was war-torn. Korea was not running itself as an independent state for effectively centuries, because it was always basically heavily under the influence of either Japan or China. And so when it was granted independence, you have the immediate war between North and South Korea, between communist forces and U.S.-backed non-communist forces, probably the best way to put it. And then it doesn't get out of a military dictatorship, doesn't get into what we would probably categorize as like a legitimate democratic or Republican style government until the 80s. So again, this
late
is
80s.
Late 80s. This is relatively new. All right. So I want you to think, George W. Bush is president before these guys, or Judge H.W. Bush is president before these guys are essentially operating politically in a way that we would recognize here in the United States. And so, as you can imagine, there was a huge push to try to prevent concentrations of power. And part of the ways that they do that is, you don't do things like spoil systems, right? You reduce the overall power of the executive branch. You put a lot of power within your parliament. You put a lot of power maybe potentially within your judiciary. You disperse it, right? And I think we as Americans can appreciate that on some level. The problem is that when you don't strike the right balance, now all of a sudden it's like, who's actually running stuff?
It's not even the elected officials at that point.
Oh, in fact, not only is it not the elected official, but you got to understand, when being an elected official puts a huge target on your back for the other branches of government to essentially use lawfare against you, a lot of times the safest position to be in if you want to exercise power but not necessarily be the target is to be a part of the bureaucracy. And so I think it's important to understand that these things, how you set up your democracy, right? How you set up representative government matters if you want to have the proper incentive structures. This kind of left-wing narrative that as long as it's democracy, it's good, is historically ignorant in the extreme, because there will always be people that attempt to concentrate power, and all you did was give them a different mechanism in order to do it.
And ignorant is the best way to put it. It can be dangerous in the extreme. I mean, look at what happened to Athens. But
well, and this is also something too where we look at conservatives, because right now there's a big battle on, okay, what happens in the United States? Because we have a lot of people that are going a lot farther than just we want to see reforms with respect to the federal government. You have people actually offering significant reforms of the way our government is structured. And the one thing that I would just encourage everyone to remember is that there is something to be said for stable government and peaceful transitions of power that people have a great deal of confidence in. This is one of the things that, we've kind of warned Democrats on whenever they've got in power and suddenly wanted to stack the Supreme Court or get rid of certain institutions, or, hey, we need to get rid of the Electoral College and just go with the popular vote. It's like, this might all sound nice to you, but you're now creating conditions where half the country is constantly at war with the other half in order to control this massive federal apparatus that gets to intervene on every aspect of our lives. So I mention all of this because Korea is dealing with this right now.
Yes. So to try to carry us to 2022, because this is actually an important part of the story of how you got this self-coup that was attempted a few days ago. 2017, again, Park's removed from office. There's a new special election for president. The left-wing Democratic Party candidate ends up getting elected. And so, according to this news article here that I pulled from 2017, left-wing former human rights lawyer Moon Jae-in won South Korea's presidential election by a landslide Tuesday, according to official figures. It goes on to say that they gave Moon of the Democratic Party, who backs engagement with the North, 40.2% support, some 11 million votes. The conservatives dubbed him a, quote, pro-Pyongyang leftist, but they fell far behind because they were reeling from the fact that their former president is now sitting in a jail cell. So it didn't really go great for them. Left wing swept into power. Moon's administration ended up being a complete disaster for a variety of reasons. They were he tried to become basically the South Korean version of FDR. If his former predecessor was the daughter of South Korea's Franco, he was trying to be South Korea's FDR. And some examples here that I'll just go through. So again, he wanted peaceful Korean unification with the North, which isn't in of itself a bad thing, but it is a bad thing when you decide that I want to be giving more carrot than stick to a, let's be honest, ruthless quasi-Marxist military dictatorship. North Korea no longer identifies as a communist regime, but let's be honest, they are the end result of Marxism.
They've got their own ideology called Juche, which is really interesting, and it's focused around this concept of complete self-reliance, right?
It's like autarky.
Yeah, it really is. Well, it just goes to show too that, look, as we kind of fight through battles on trade and things like that in the United States, one of the things I think Trump gets, I don't think Trump is as pro-tariff as people think he is. I think he understands tariffs as a good negotiating tool. But this is what happens when a country attempts to be completely self-reliant: is they starve. And so,
in the name of a revolutionary ideology that can never end, too, right? Because let's be honest, it's not like North Korea's problems are just because they don't do international trade.
Yeah,
In fact,
it's a whole
if
host
that
of
was the
problems.
only problem that they had, they'd be a lot better off right now,
Yeah.
right? If they were just isolationist instead of being, extremely oppressive and murdering they're running basically a concentration camp the size of a country.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But Moon's administration was super pro left wing on economics as well. Raised taxes, supported huge minimum wage hikes, engaged in a massive trade war with Japan that crippled both countries' economies. At one point, like they were cutting off diplomatic relations with each other. It was really, really bad between the two countries.
I will tell you this. This is kind of like an aside, but it's relevant. One of the ways I can tell I probably don't like a national leader is when Wikipedia says during COVID-19, Moon received praise domestically and internationally. Okay, that means you engaged in massive lockdowns and control the economy and probably money printing.
And the reason I have Wikipedia up here is actually because they have a left-wing bias, and I want to show it from his perspective on a left-wing bias. Like, huge expansions in government involvement in healthcare. He was a very polarizing figure when he was in office, but part of the reason that his party did not succeed him after his kind of special term ended in 2022 is because, and this is where we're getting into what's going to lead us to today. So, here's the story. This is now from 2021. South Korea's former top prosecutor, whose battles with President Moon Jae-in made him one of the country's most popular, this is going to change eventually, most popular political figures, is expected to declare his candidacy to seek the top job himself. Mr. Moon Seok-yeol, who was appointed prosecutor general, Yoon Suk-yeol, who was appointed prosecutor general by Moon before feuding with the administration and resigning, has called a news conference at 1 p.m. to deliver a message to the Korean people. This man is the current president.
Yeah.
Now, we have a thread here that is fantastic that explains what has happened. We will go through this in chunks.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I know this thread is fantastic because there's been commentators from South Korea itself that cover Korean politics on X that have commented on this and retweeted it and have said, this is a good synopsis of what has happened to the country.
So let's start into that.
We'll go through bits and pieces of this. I won't read through the entire thing in one sitting, but we will go through this whole thing, right? Sure. Oh, never mind. I can't. It's fine. We'll read through it. So what happened? Why was martial law declared? We will get to this. Isn't South Korea an esteemed republic where stuff like this doesn't happen? I'm writing this article to discover all these questions. Please forgive me for its poor quality because I'm rushing it through. He put this out like immediately after it happened. Long story short, President Yoon issued. Remember, he's the guy that won in 2022. He succeeded Moon.
But he was the guy that the left-wing government brought in to prosecute and try to clean up corruption. And he ended up resigning over frustration and dealing with that government, and then became the top candidate for the right-wing party and got elected.
And this this thread on X will explain that as well. So long story short, President Yoon issued a poorly planned martial law in a desperate attempt to stop anti-Korean lawless subversive forces from successfully impeaching him, which they've been actively trying to do since he entered office by installing Lee Jae-myung as president. We're going to get to him in a minute. Who was on the verge of facing a series of massive convictions that would put him in jail for the rest of his life. The story begins in 2017, where Yoon was at first an ally to the Democratic Party and the left. You'd be confused how that's the case since he's the right-wing president, but I'll explain. Yoon is a prosecutor who was appointed to the special counsel to head investigations into the Park Geun-hye administration, remember her, after scandals broke of her sharing power illegally with a private citizen. This successfully led to the removal of President Park and the courts, which led to a 90-day special election. That's the one that we talked about in 2017. The Democratic Party's nominee, Moon Jae-in, won easily with 41% of the vote. He only won a plurality, but remember, the opposition was split many ways. He pledged to hold all the officials and Conservative Party accountable with unprecedented prosecutions and previous corruption scandals. He appointed Yoon to head this operation by sending him to lead the prosecutorial office in Seoul, which is the second most powerful position in terms of issuing indictments and investigations. This was vehemently opposed by conservative parties as they feared political revenge and prosecutions, but their support was in single digits while Moon cruised to 80%. So you get what's happening here. The conservative forces are shattered because of a variety of corruption scandals that just destroys them. And they previously held the presidency. They not only lose the presidency in an impeachment, they then get obliterated in the presidential election after that. They also get obliterated in the legislative elections. They have nothing.
Yeah, they're done.
New left-wing government comes in and says, we're going to clean house. We're going to deal with all this corruption scandals. And we're going to put in basically a special counsel, independent voice, who's apolitical, doesn't have any prior political experience, but he does have experience within law enforcement and, you know, within the judicial system to do this work. He picks this individual. And at this point, Yoon is an ally of the left because he's been appointed to this important job of basically cleaning house. This is where the state of the country is in, 2017, 2018. Then a political purge began. Over 200 former government officials were arrested, including 2 former presidents, right? Over half of them came out not guilty in the courts 5 years later. Then the purge extended to judges, where the former Chief Justice was also arrested. He also came out not guilty. Conservatives in all 3 branches faced an unprecedented assault. However, this was the end of Yoon and the left's good relationship. And we actually have a few examples of this that I brought up here. So remember, this was the article that I read off about how, he used to be allied with the left-wing administration.
I think we've got that established. I mean,
okay. So now, Moon then tried to appoint.
So this guy's out. He's trying to appoint someone else into
a presidential hopeful and one of the most popular politicians in the Democratic Party's base. So he tries to take a independent voice after they've obliterated the right using, in some cases, very legitimate prosecutions. But obviously, as we've seen from here, some of these other people, prominent voices within, the Chief Justice.
And here's the important part to remember. When half of the people you're prosecuting are being found not guilty, you have cast a very, very wide net. Now, that also begs the question on okay, if this was the guy that was in charge of running all of these investigations, we have this many people coming under indictment, how much of it, this is the part that gets confusing, right? How much is he actually blessing off on? But for some reason, there's now trouble, right? There's now trouble in paradise between the independent voice they've brought in to be a prosecutor. So now that they've kind of created this environment, now they're getting rid of the guy they put in there who was the independent voice, and they're trying to replace him with a hardcore left-wing ally.
Yes. So Moon appointed a new Moon then tried to appoint Cho Kook, a presidential hopeful and one of the most popular politicians within the Democratic Party's base, his own party, as justice minister. Within days, scandals emerged of his use of private equity funds and corruption behind the administration process of his daughter to medical school. Yoon, in the eyes of the Democratic Party, betrayed them and pursued those prosecutions along with a series of other charges plaguing the Blue House. The Blue House is South Korea's White House, quite literally. That is the residency of the president. In fact, fun fact, in the I believe in the 1970s, North Korean assassination agents snuck into South Korea and tried to murder the president of South Korea in the Blue House. There was a firefight that took place there, famously. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent. But long story short, so this guy puts in one of his own party loyalists into a very important position that's supposed to be somewhat apolitical, right, as justice minister. Well, there's this huge scandal that comes up involving him. Yoon goes after this guy, and at that point, the president's like, whoa, no, you're supposed to be going after my political enemies, not my political allies.
Yeah.
And so it goes on to say, he felt like that he had betrayed them and pursued prosecutions along with a series of other charges plaguing the Blue House. One including pressuring police release of sham warrants to win a gubernatorial election in 2018. Cho was appointed, but was so unpopular that President Moon's approval rating plummeted to the 30s for the first time. Remember, he used to be very popular at first.
Yeah, 80% approval ratings dropped down to 30, and in part because, again, you've brought in there's a legitimate corruption problem. So you bring in the independent guy to deal with the corruption problem. Lo and behold, as he's finding corruption on the right, turns out he finds corruption on the left. And that's when the left goes, whoa, we didn't mean that kind of corruption. And so now they're trying to get rid of him.
And so his approval rating plunges into the 30s, leading to his resignation. This is when the vengeance campaign began. By his resignation, we mean the justice minister. Moon appointed a new justice minister who used all powers at her disposal to kick out all of Yoon's allies from key positions of power and used leaks of his prosecutorial misconduct to strip him as well as being able to do anything with the current investigations. However, Yoon still refused to resign. In response, the Democratic Party, who has a filibuster-proof majority in the legislature, introduced legislation to create a new department that strips all key investigative powers from the current prosecutorial offices. To stop this, Yoon resigned. This year-long saga ironically made Yoon the most popular presidential candidate among conservatives, as the right-wing party was too weak and incompetent to fight the rampaging left who had all of the power. So remember, the right has just rudderless. This is their equivalent of like being a Republican in the 1930s, right? They just had nothing. And suddenly this guy who's very popular for going after corruption is now getting into this huge fight with the ruling left-wing party that controls everything in South Korea. And so now the right, who were previously being prosecuted by him, is like begging him basically to stand up as their nominee.
Because he has credibility.
Yeah.
He's gone after both sides. He was actually, again, at this stage in the analysis, you're like, okay, this guy was trying to faithfully execute the duties of this office, which was go after corruption no matter where you find it. And what they found is the ruling party was like, well, we didn't mean wherever you found it. I want to answer a question here real quick that came in from Darth. He goes, question, do you think a similar political climate could occur in the U.S. if Trump goes after Democrats who have committed crimes if Biden doesn't pardon all of them? That's kind of what we're trying to analyze here. Now, there's a couple things to keep in mind. Trump is actually going in with a far more friendly Congress and a Supreme Court that is not inclined to this sort of, thing. And so that's going to be a major difference between what Yoon was facing as president versus what Donald Trump's going to be facing. But the important thing to remember here is that the bureaucracy will fight to defend itself. And one of the most important things you're going to read up here is when they said that. So again, you got the independent counsel that came in, started conducting prosecutions. Now the left doesn't like who they're prosecuting, so they get rid of them and they try to replace them with somebody else. That guy won't resign. So what do? Oh, they start leaking things to the press. Oh, look at all this leaks. Look at all this prosecutorial misconduct. That doesn't work. So what do they do then? They go to their National Assembly and they create like a department right next to this department that strips this department of all of its powers and moves it over to here. So they're like, okay, we're not going to force this guy. We can't force this guy to resign. We'll just make you irrelevant. We'll just make you irrelevant. And so in order to prevent that, he resigns, right? But this is playing out in front of the public. So again, do I think our Congress doesn't have the ability to say, create an entirely new Justice Department or to create they technically do, but they're not going to. But could they try to come up with something, like if they got control of the House back or if they got control of Congress back in the midterms, could they then try to strip power away from maybe special prosecutors or try to limit what they're doing or do a bunch of hearings? Yeah, they could, but probably not to the degree of what you were seeing in here. This is what happens when the left has such overwhelming control of the legislature that even though the chief executive might have been on the right, okay, what are you going to do if the legislature can literally just come in and just, crush it?
That's actually about to happen. So at this point
it's a left-wing president with a left-wing parliament.
At this point in 2020, 2021, it's the left controls everything still.
Yeah.
Yoon runs for president then, ironically enough, as the right-wing candidate in 2022. Goes on to say this year-long saga ironically made him the most popular presidential candidate among the conservative base as the right-wing party was too weak and incompetent to fight the rampaging left who had all the powers. Therefore, he was nominated and became president of South Korea. That is the election that we covered at the very start of this of this podcast. We'll
let's not go back. We already addressed
You saw the
this.
map.
Yeah.
You saw the map
Yeah,
earlier.
we already addressed it. Yeah.
Yoon pledged to finish the investigations that he was hampered from doing so as president, and this terrified the Democratic Party. Therefore, they passed legislation because, remember, Yoon won the presidency, but they still control the legislature, and they almost have like a supermajority. They're very, very close to it. Therefore, they passed legislation during the transition period to strip the prosecutorial office from key investigative powers and was signed by President Moon when he was the lame duck president leaving office. And this is where this individual comes in. Lee Jae-myung, the leader of the Democratic Party and the former 2022 nominee who lost to Yoon, He's going to show up more and more, you're about to see here. He too faced corruption charges where 5 people mysteriously committed suicide during the investigative process.
This sounds like Hillary Clinton level stuff.
He is a very bad man, this guy. The scandals involved money laundering of a 1 billion won construction project and the bribing of a Supreme Court justice to produce a not guilty verdict. In one of his other scandals, this guy has a lot going on for him.
Yeah.
You'll see. Another one involves a case where Lee broke the election laws that would force the Democratic Party to reimburse all the public campaign funds they've used in the last presidential cycle. So before Yoon even entered office, the Democratic Party was united in an effort to stop these prosecutions at all costs. Due to this new legislation, the investigations became much slower and seriously delayed. Lee and the left also deployed multiple obstruction efforts to delay a ruling so that a conviction isn't produced during Yoon's 5-year term. Therefore, Yoon expedited the process by appointing new people in prosecutorial offices and filled a vacant Supreme Court seat with a new Chief Justice who was bent on not letting this happen. Now the plan changed. The Democratic Party must impeach Yoon and remove him from office. They cannot delay the convictions for 5 years. With a cratering economy, though, rising prices, and Yoon's zero political experience prior to becoming president, he is very unpopular. I have articles up here that I can go through to show it, and maybe we'll do that once we get through this. But do you get where this is going?
Yeah.
Yoon is like Trump in the sense he has no political experience, doesn't know how the game is played, doesn't know how the sausage is made. He was just he was a prosecutor.
Yeah.
Which is somewhat political related, but he doesn't know how power politics goes. He doesn't know how whining and dying, all the dirty stuff that involves and I don't mean dirty stuff in the sense that it's illegal. I just mean
what we call retail
politics.
Kissing babies, shaking hands, showing up to,
He's a guy that's just like, I just want to fix my country. I want the corruption to stop, and I want the lawfare to end. And that's the reason that I was originally put into this position until the people who put me in there tried to take me out of it because I went after them.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to run for president to finally get the job done. He wins very narrowly. And what is considered the most hotly contested election in Korean history, in the history of South Korean elections. And yet the left-wing party now utterly hates him. And so they have used their control of the legislature to basically just cripple him. And yet he figured out that, well, look, I can appoint people to certain positions within the Justice Department, their equivalent of the Justice Department, or to the Supreme Court in order to expedite and finally get through this and get around the obstruction that they put in place. And so then the left wing, the Democratic Party is like, oh, the plan has now changed. We can't just wait him out for 5 years. We need to actively remove him from office, or else literally our leaders are going to go to prison.
This is the part where people need to be paying attention in the United States. So the first tactic oftentimes of the establishment, of the entrenched bureaucracy, is just to wait you out. It's just to wait you out. Because unless you're coming in with a massive mandate or a huge amount of popularity or a determined focus, when Trump came in his first year, he was trying to reconcile with the people that had already been there, that knew how the sausage was made, and okay, now we're going to get things done. And again, the way I worded this before was I think the negotiation Trump imagined his first term was, I'm going to bring you guys in to show me how things work, and then I'm going to tell you what needs to be reformed, and then we're going to reform it. And what Trump learned very, very quickly is they have no interest. This included a lot of Republicans too. They had no interest in reforming it, right? Knowing how the system works becomes power. I can't emphasize this enough. This is true of every bureaucracy. Everybody I know that has to engage with bureaucracy from the outside hates it until they figure out how it works. And then it gives them very special and unique power that they're able to wield that nobody else can. And so now everybody else that wants something from the bureaucracy has to go through them. So the first term, I'm going to tell you this right now. I didn't think this at the time. It was a blessing Trump lost his first reelection, or had it stolen, however you believe it. It's a blessing. It's a blessing, because I think Trump realized a lot of the people I thought I could work with, I can't. I need to do something different. And that's why you see very, very different cabinet selections going this first time. But here's the other thing I want everyone to understand. And thankfully, Trump made some mistakes with respect to how he handled things, but he didn't do anything this crazy. Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, one of the biggest things he pushes there is your action is the right's reaction or your target's reaction. And so what did they do here? The first thing was, we'll wait this guy out. We'll wait this guy out. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He didn't come with a major mandate. We'll wait him out. Well, again, this guy wasn't sitting here wanting to debate the top percentage of the marginal income tax rate. He wanted to get to prosecutions. That was his whole platform. That's what he wanted to do. And so now he starts to make maneuvers in order to do that. And what do? The Democratic Party must impeach Yoon and remove him from office. So you have to create scandals. You have to leak things to the press. You have to create issues where you can go after subordinates that he's put in power. You have to do it. You have to impeach him, right? You have to come up with conditions that that at least look like it. You got to have all of your experts within your intel agencies say that this is, disinformation and this is that. And oh my gosh, you had somebody working in the White House that overheard a phone conversation and oh my God, is this corruption? And now for 2 years, all you're talking about is corruption. Well, Yoon, not really knowing what he was doing in politics, what does he resort to is he sees all of this coming about. Now, remember, he came in as a prosecutor under a left-wing administration, trying to do his job. I'm being very favorable to Yoon right now with this description. I realize it's more complex. Gets kicked out because he insists on doing his job. And then ends up becoming the head or the chief candidate for the Conservative Party, wins his election and says, okay, now I can do something about the problem. And finds out very quickly, oh, no, you can't. Because they'll do all these legal maneuvers in order to try to delay you. And then when you find a way around the legal maneuvers, now they'll do everything they can to destroy you. And so what's Yoon's response? Therefore, Yoon, being desperate, issued this martial law, which is a catastrophic mistake, as no one in the public agrees with it. So he withdrew it.
Hang on. We've jumped just a little bit ahead here for a second. Look at what they did in order to try to tee up an impeachment of him. So, this explanation goes on to say, they must impeach him, remove him from office. They can't wait 5 years. And so they've escalated as many scandals as they possibly could find to deploy articles of impeachment and have 8 PPP members, that's the conservative right-wing party, have 8 members flip in their favor. Impeachment requires 200 votes. The opposition, which is the Democratic Party, has 192
so they're close.
Votes in the legislature. They additionally filed articles of impeachment on prosecutors investigating these cases, a cabinet member, and are obstructing all legislative procedures to essentially make Yoon a lame duck president. Therefore, Yoon, being desperate, like you said, issued this martial law, which is a catastrophic mistake as no one in the public agrees with it, so he withdrew. Yoon, with this move, gave perfect grounds for impeachment and most likely will plummet to single-digit approvals as backlash for this extremely foolish move. PPP members will flip in favor. That actually might change. We'll get to that in a second. It's up to the courts to decide whether to approve the articles of impeachment, but I believe it's highly likely considering the current atmosphere. Then Lee Jae-myung will most likely win in a 90-day special election before any of his cases face a final conviction in the Supreme Court. He will become president in this current trajectory. This is a very rushed article, yada, yada. Point is that Yoon, let's now get to what actually happened here, right? So Wikipedia puts out this article, after this comes out where they're talking about this martial law declaration, where they give some reasons for it. And one of them is, opposition to budget proposals and attempted impeachment of prosecutors and involved scandals. Now, when you look at some of the stuff that was happening, I just want to briefly go through some of this stuff, right? So,
I'm going to hold you to briefly.
Okay. I'm just going to go through some of the headlines. So you already see in 2023, his popularity was starting to fall. This is Yoon's. Here's an example right here. Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung attends first trial in his corruption and bribery cases. Prosecutors indict Democratic Party chief on corruption charges. Goes on to continue with close aide to his leader is sentenced to a 5-year jail term in developing corruption scandals. So this is plaguing the entire Democratic Party right now.
Yeah.
What's happening to them is what happened to the conservatives in 2017.
Yeah.
Where they're getting, railed right now within the judicial system. Railroaded, although from their perspective, they're being railroaded, but from the right-wing perspective, it's no, you weaponized law, you didn't just remove our president from power, which you could argue is totally justified. You then tried to eradicate the right as a political movement using the long arm of government in order, the long arm of the law in order to do so. And now you thought that you'd never lose another election again. So you basically, lived at large.
Yeah.
And now the, shoe's on the other foot and you're under trouble. Well, Yoon gets into office and his approval rating starts to crater. Why? Because the left-wing party that controls the legislature is like, we just won't pass anything. Even like basic functions of government.
We won't even, there's
we
no
won't
budget.
even pass a budget.
Yeah, there's nothing.
We will shut the entire country down in order to screw over this particular guy and in order to try to tank his approval ratings. And since he doesn't know what he's doing because he's new to politics, he doesn't know how to respond to it. So his approval rating collapses. Here's another article. Why did Yoon's party lose in South Korea's elections? This was their equivalent of the midterms. And so this was in April of this year. This is actually an important article. I'm going to go through a little bit of it. South Korean voters handed liberals an extended opposition control of parliament. Some experts say that it makes Yoon a lone duck or even a dead duck.
Lame duck, yeah.
Lame duck. And so long story short, like he was not able to do anything because he can't pass anything. So he was having to basically rule by executive decree where he possibly can. And yet the country's in crisis right now. There's like,
well, but so all of that, like the sum up of all of that is, again, he goes in there, he's trying to do the prosecutions. They use all the legislative authority they possibly can to basically stifle him doing so. He makes some missteps. He gets crushed in the midterms. Now it's even worse. They're trying to push for the impeachment. And again, his response, going back to the Saul Alinsky, his reaction to all of what the left is doing is, okay, the last thing I got, the last, arrow in the quiver is I'm declaring martial law. And again, he tried to blame it on like North Korean communist, like he's trying to come up with this justification in order to institute martial law. Nobody buys it. Nobody buys it. Like I'm watching conservative commentators in the United States talk about this and like, how do you fight communism with more communism, right? Because of imposing martial law. Now, again, that might not be a fair understanding of what's going on, but as we've discussed many times in politics, once you lose the narrative, that's it. You've lost it.
Martial law is never a popular option.
No.
I remember people saying Trump should declare martial
Oh my
law back in the
God.
day. And I'm like, if you want to lose every election for the next several decades, he can go ahead and do that.
And this is another thing that one of the major reasons why I thought discussing this and allowing people to understand how this has developed in South Korea over time is because there are so many conservatives that will be like, we need to do this. And I'm like, okay, I'm all with you on reducing the size of the federal government, using every mechanism of power that we can to actually do it. And we're in a much better position than Yoon was in South Korea to be able to actually affect that. But if you decide to go overboard where it's just like, we're going to round everybody up or we're going to do this or they're all going to jail or Hillary's, going to jail for life. Okay, if you do that, there will be a reaction. You are going to lose a certain sector of the population that was willing to vote for Trump because they see the problems and they're tired of the wokeness, but they're not going to be with you on something like this. And some people on the right will look at me and like, Nick, you're just not being strong enough. You don't know what needs to be done. I'm like, no, that's not it. I understand the way Saul Alinsky has trained leftist activists in order to get us to react in a way that goes beyond what has actual popular support, not support on your Rumble channel.
Yeah.
Right? So if you want to be successful, yes, you have to do things. Like show me the one cabinet level position that Trump has picked right now that I have not praised. I'm for it. I'm all for Doge. I'm all for doing all of it. Okay, Stefanik was my favorite. But they probably put her in the one position I'd be happy to have, and that's UN ambassador. But the point is they did it. Right? I'm going to give you, we're going to draw a parallel here that is going to get me in trouble with some. And it's not a parallel to the sense of degree. It's more of a parallel when you look at Saul Alinsky's idea of our action is about their reaction. We are trying to get them to do something. We're needling. That's what the left does. We're needling. We're poking. And we want you to get so frustrated and so angry that the response that you give makes the people that aren't paying attention think you're the crazy one. January 6th.
Yeah.
January 6th. There was a lot of people that were like, this doesn't seem right. There is something wrong here. You guys changed a bunch of voting laws. And during special we had a judge in Virginia going, you did not change these voting laws.
They mailed a ballot
correctly.
to everybody. That's why the turnout was so high.
They did all of this stuff that was just really shady. And a lot of people were like, this isn't right. Something is wrong. And then as soon as January 6th happened,
that was the whole narrative.
I don't care what you think about. I think I've got a constituent right now that I am helping that is facing prosecution 2 years after the fact for not even going into the Capitol, and I'm helping the guy. Like, please do not believe.
Yeah, just for taking video.
Yeah, please do not believe that I'm sitting here going, oh yeah, January 6th was the worst thing since 9/11. That is not my position.
This is very dangerous for a democracy.
Yeah,
but they were able to run with the narrative.
They were able to run with the narrative, and for anybody that is not really politically astute or that was watching things that were going on, I was like, oh my gosh, this is horrific. And by the way, there were really horrible things that happened on January 6th that never should have happened. And oh, by the way, Trump was furiously tweeting out, peacefully, don't break the law. We don't do this. We believe in rule of law. And then Twitter shut him down.
And because they booted him.
And booted him. Trump was the one asking for additional security on Inauguration Day. Pelosi was the one turning. They wanted a crisis. This is the part that I'm trying to get people to understand.
They wanted the crisis.
They wanted the crisis. There was all kinds of things they could have done to help prevent it that still would have gotten Joe Biden, confirmed, right? Still would have certified the electoral vote. There's all kinds of things they could have done that still would have resulted in what they wanted. They wanted the crisis because they knew there was a bunch of shady stuff that went on.
And they didn't want it uncovered.
Yes. And like my whole point with this, and the reason why I get so worked up about this is it is really important to understand that half the time, like they are, yes, I get it. They are doing things that are just outrageous. And it is so frustrating to watch a media that glazes over it or gaslights you. It's so frustrating to watch Hollywood gaslight you. It's so frustrating to watch politicians gaslighting you. And it is a normal sentiment to look at all that gaslighting and finally say, screw you. So it's not that I don't want to hit back hard. I do. But you have to be hitting back hard in a way that allows you to maintain popular support. Otherwise, the backlash you get will be horrific. If you lose the popular support in a representative system, you lose. It doesn't matter how justified you think your actions are. It's one of my favorite laws from Morton Blackwell. It's the Sir Galahad approach to politics. I'm going to win because my cause is just. And if I just express it appropriately and believe in it hard enough, it's going to happen. Stop being a child. No, it won't. This is the time for us to be smart about what we do and how we do it. And the thing that I admire about what Trump has done, especially with the things like Doge, ladies and gentlemen, I am telling you right now, get ready for 2 years of the Democrats saying that everything Doge wants to cut is going to result in kids not getting free and reduced lunches and people starving and grandma dying because all we're doing is helping billionaires at the expense of the elderly and children. That is going to be the consistent narrative over the next 2 years because they're going to try to erode popular support, or they're going to try to get us to react in a way to where they can steal popular support from us. The best thing that we can do is to hit hard, but to do it with the sort of reasoned responses that anticipate what they're trying to get us to do. Don't walk into an ambush. Don't walk into it. This dude walked right into an ambush, and South Korea is about to be in a ton of trouble. They're already in trouble. But arguably the one guy that was actually dedicated outside of politics to go after the corruption, no matter where it was, to hopefully significantly reform the way business was done, the one guy that was doing this, that had a mandate to do it, or not a mandate, but to come into power and do it, has just destroyed himself. Why? Because he decided he was going to take a no-nonsense approach. You want to do this? Fine. I'm going to come down and I'm going to declare martial law.
Now,
he's done.
Allow me to defend Yoon here a little bit. I don't think that he was trying to be, I'm Mr. Tough Strongman. I think that he was frustrated and upset at the fact that it is obvious that the system the political and legal system has been weaponized by the left in that country against his administration and against the right in general, which is now, well, up until now, had embraced him as their leader because they kind of lacked for one.
Yeah.
And he's looking around and he's like, you people shouldn't be able to get away with this stuff.
Yeah.
I have a few more articles that I want to go through the headlines here.
And I'm not trying to say that Yoon is like a horrible human being, right? What I'm trying to say is that this is one of the things that people outside of the political process look at, and it frustrates them, and they should be justifiably frustrated. But the problem is, it's one of the chief rules that they taught us in special forces. They hammered this into us everywhere we went. And the reason why is because SF was designed to go into situations where we were outnumbered. We were designed to go into situations where we didn't have the same level of combat power as a conventional unit. Hey, 12-man ODA, we're going to link you up with this indigenous force that you're going to train, lead, and advise in order to go accomplish missions. And you had to constantly be dealing with a whole host of situations that your average infantry unit never deals with. Never. That's why I joke that one of the things that prepared me for politics was having a background in unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency, because we were constantly dealing with these aspects that had nothing to do with combat power on the ground. It had to do with everything, with political ideology, culture, religion, all of these things that we had to factor in before we did something. And it's like I will see people who get frustrated with a situation and can see a problem, but because they don't understand the operational environment that is politics, that is DC, they are looking for a simple solution to something when it may be simple in the sense that we've identified the problem. Reagan said this best: a lot of solutions are simple, they're just hard. And I am so desperate to get something significantly necessary done over the next 2 years that we need to be able to learn from mistakes we've made in the past. We need to be able to learn from mistakes that are happening in other countries right now. And we need to start understanding the tactics. Because again, if you can spot an ambush, you can avoid it. And there's a lot of dividends to be paid there. But my gosh, if you walk right into it because I want the guy that's just going to like, no nonsense, please understand the operational environment.
So look at what has been written into the impeachment articles for you. So Yoon's going to be impeached. The question is whether or not he's going to be removed from office. The PPP has come out actually and said that they oppose his impeachment. And so there's this expectation that the conservatives, because there was a handful of conservative members of the legislature that got into the legislature when the martial law was declared and voted to void it. So actually, we need to put a bow on that story first before we go forward. So Yoon declares martial law, right? Part of the reason that he does so is because of actually this headline that I want to. Well, I just had it a second ago, but okay. Long story short, part of the reason he does it is because the left is just weaponized, so many mechanisms in order to thwart his attempt to actually execute what he thinks is a mandate. Here it is. South Korea spiraling towards a polarized justice system. You think?
Yeah.
We remember everything we just went through, like going all the way back to, 2008. Like, it's like every president has either been thrown in prison or impeached or has some sort of huge corruption scandal.
Mm-hmm.
Like to be president of South Korea is to be cursed at this point.
Yeah.
But part of the reason is because it's the unraveling of institutional trust within what used to be a very high trust society.
Yeah.
And so you just keep going through here, and it's like all of this is actually from a more slightly left-wing perspective, but how South Korea's democratic decay has worsened under President Yoon. The way that they portray this makes it seem like it's his fault, which I disagree with, obviously. Not that he's entirely without blame, but I think most of his fault is not from malice. I think it's more from him not
understanding the operational environment of politics. Yeah.
Keep going through here real quick. Main opposition party scrambles to defend former President Moon in hiring scandal. So, I mean, it keeps going on and on and on, right? Former President Moon urges DP's lead to oust conservatives from presidency.
We get it.
So point is that, he declares martial law, right? And part of the reason that he fails let's be honest, this is a self-coup. He declares martial law. He doesn't tell anybody about it except for his his military. He doesn't even inform his own party
Mm-hmm.
that he's doing this. His party finds out on X that martial law has been declared.
Yeah.
And so the other thing that he does, and here, well, I'll actually pull up just the Wikipedia article for it because it'll give a brief synopsis of what happened here. Right? So if you go through here, and it talks about some of the stuff that we talked about, right? But here's the declaration of martial law. He reads an emergency address. He declares martial law in a televised address. He accuses the opposition of, quote, trying to overthrow the free democracy by impeaching members of his cabinet and blocking his budget plans. He also asks citizens to believe in him and tolerate some inconveniences. He also claims that there was a North Korean conspiracy against the South Korean government. What he means by that is that these are left-wing, basically socialists that want to turn South Korea into 1930s U.S. under FDR, quite literally. I'll get to that in a second. And that they want to pivot South Korea away from being more friendly with Japan and the United States, more towards North Korea and China. And so he wraps this up in a bow and says this is a North Korean conspiracy, which it isn't really fully a North Korean conspiracy. He's taking some liberties there, but
It's like when we called Kamala a communist,
yes.
even though she's not from the Communist Party.
Yeah.
So he puts this out. He basically says, yeah, there's martial law. And then he directs the military to go storm the South Korean parliament and arrest the opposition leaders, which includes the man that he defeated in 2022 that's leading the charge to impeach him, that wants to become president himself. Well, doesn't really work out, in part because the military gets there. There was actually clips of like tanks rolling through Seoul. And the military gets there. The parliament, which is controlled by the left wing, they barricade the doors with, like chairs and and stuff like that and desks. They start spraying like fire extinguishers at the military as they're trying to like break into the windows to get in and arrest the opposition.
Yeah.
And it gets to a point where it's like the military is there. They're trying to get in. And the question is, they're being pushed back, not through violent means, but it's like just under violent means. And so now the question is, do they resort to force?
Yeah. Do you escalate?
Do they resort to force? And it's like time is of the essence because they're about to vote under South Korea's constitution. The legislature can vote to override martial law.
Yeah.
And obviously the left-wing parties have the votes to do that. They're trying to get people into the building to form a quorum to do that. And so now the military has a difficult question of, do you cross the Rubicon?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately they chose not to. But here's where things are incredibly difficult from a realpolitik perspective. Do you remember what happened to Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner group in Russia?
Yeah.
So, he stages this rebellion. He says that, Putin's mismanaging the war. He's killing my men. He's, he's doing all these things.
Yeah.
We need to oust him and basically make Russia great again, right? And he stages a rebellion for about 24 hours. He literally marches on Moscow with his army of like 20,000 men or whatever, shoots down a bunch of Russian helicopters, and comes within a hair's breadth of getting into the Russian capital. He almost overthrows Vladimir Putin, and then he strikes a deal with Putin, turns around and goes home. And then what happens exactly 2 months later?
Oh, he's killed.
He dies, in a mysterious plane crash where his plane just for no reason just exploded over Russian airspace. Long story short, Putin killed him.
Yeah.
Right? It's obvious that Putin killed him. What Prigozhin did is that, there's this line in Plutarch's Lives where he writes about the lives of famous figures from his perspective of the past. This is written, 2,000 years ago. But he wrote this very famous book, biography of Julius Caesar. And there's this line in there about Julius Caesar getting to the Rubicon. And, he stops for a while. He weighs his options. He knows that if he crosses this river, it's going to trigger a civil war. There's no turning back at that point, and who knows what could happen. But then, he also thinks about, well, what if he doesn't? And so he waits for a while, and then finally he declares the die is cast, and he hurries across the river and asks his legion to join him. The
ancient version of it is what it is.
Yeah. And he asks his 13th legion to follow him, and they do. And what follows is a civil war that results in him defeating Pompey, becoming dictator, and setting the stage for a generation after him, of course, the collapse of the Roman Republic and the founding of the empire under his nephew Octavian. He becomes Augustus. Well, what happened with Prigozhin is a classic example of, if you are going to cross the Rubicon, you cannot turn
Yeah.
around halfway into the river.
Yeah.
If your feet are wet, you have to keep going. To do otherwise is to guarantee your own demise.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because you have declared yourself an enemy of the state, the powers that be, the current powers that rule things, but you've not followed through. They're going to kill you, or depending on the circumstances, remove you from power, or it is the end of you politically. In some cases, it could be the end of your life in the case of Prigozhin. And so if you take that extra step, if you step into the river of the Rubicon, you have to keep going.
Yeah.
In Caesar's case, he couldn't have gotten halfway into the river and said, actually, I changed my mind. I want to go back to Gaul. No, the Senate's going to, you're the enemy of the state now.
Yeah.
You have to fight to win.
No, and he tried to.
And in Prigozhin's case, he made a mistake that he paid with his life by not following through. The question should have been, do you stage the rebellion?
Mm-hmm.
The question should not be, do you continue the rebellion?
Well, and this is the part too that I think needs to be understand is that I think that there is a difficulty. There's a difficulty sometime in understanding what is a Rubicon moment. Like Caesar knew it was a Rubicon moment because of all of the things that led up to it, and he was very, very well versed in Roman politics. He knew what it meant. He knew what Pompey would have to do, right? Prigozhin should have known. Prigozhin should have known. It's like, I don't care how buddy you think you are with Putin. You're not, dude. You staged a rebellion. The comment that we have is that if you're going to go for the king, you better take the head, right? You're going to go for the crown, you got to take the head. There is no, you either win or you will lose. But the moment you are the enemy, the moment you make that decision, there's no going back. And this guy, again, I don't know what he was thinking on this. And this is also the part too where I get into these discussions all the time on simple policy issues. Because one of the things people don't understand about politics in general is that what we are debating on is who gets to use aggressive force to achieve what we want. Like we're deciding who gets to control the guys with the guns. And so there's a lot of ideas in people's minds where sometimes I will stop and ask them a question. Okay, what do you want us to do to somebody if they don't comply? Because that's what we're doing here. We're not just discussing nice little esoteric ideas. We're not discussing one of the things that, okay, so the South Korean assembly, what they decided, and they probably knew to some level, is, well, we can't just let the military walk in. No, we're going to barricade the door. We're not going to use lethal force against the military. We're not going to use force that would, encourage them to escalate or give them an excuse to escalate beyond a certain level. We're going to create it as if we're on some level just peacefully resisting. I want people to imagine in your head, how did you feel when all of those Secret Service agents jumped on Donald Trump, and then his first reaction after that was to be able to view the crowd and start going, fight, fight, fight. Dude, I don't know about you, but at that moment I was like, holy crap, dude, you point me to the hill, I'll charge it. And this is someone that did not start off as a Trump fan. But in that moment, I was like, man, that guy they just tried to kill him. And if he wanted to just hunker down and be safe, he would have, but he actually stood up, arguably exposing himself because he didn't know the shooter was taken out at that point, and fight. I guarantee you, I don't care where you are on the political spectrum in South Korea right now, when the military pulls in and you got members of parliament barring the doors and doing the fire extinguishers and everyone else, you're thinking to yourself, man, they took a stand. They were willing to show courage in the face of, potential harm. This is the part where it's, again, like you said, I don't think he fully understood that the moment you say martial law, what you are
You've crossed the
committing
Rubicon.
what you're committing to is, I'm willing to shoot people if they resist. And he wasn't, which means he should have never done martial law. Now, look, I don't claim to be an expert on South Korean politics, so I don't want to overstep my bounds here. But again, to Tina's point, I think most people should have a natural animosity toward this idea that you're going to use the military to impose your will in a system of representative government
on our own people.
On our own people, like, yeah, you better have a like an aversion to that is extreme. But again, like we laid it all out, right? This guy was not a politician. This guy was not He was not the one doing all this stuff. He was like in many cases, you could draw these comparisons going, yeah, Trump, right? Not a politician, not wanting to run, didn't need to do this, wanted to clean up corruption, wanted to do things right, loves his country. But if you overstep the bounds in a particular way, it can ruin everything. It can ruin everything. Look, I gotta mention this because if there's one of the ways that you avoid making decisions like this that just upset everything that you are trying to accomplish is to make sure you're not making these decisions on an empty stomach. And this is where Good Ranchers comes in, right? If you want to make good decisions with respect to saving the country, especially over the next 2 years, which is going to be absolutely critical, you're not just going to need to make sure you're well fed. You're going to need to make sure you're getting all the protein that you need. And Good Ranchers is here to make it happen. So not only is Good Ranchers dedicated to a strong, patriotic, God-fearing America, they're actually dedicated to making sure that you have the sort of meals that will allow you to be all of those things. And they've got a special deal going on right now. So if you subscribe to any Good Ranchers box and use my special code Nick, right? So goodranchers.com, promo code Nick, you get a free gift of either chicken breast, ground beef, bacon, or salmon for a year plus free express shipping. So once again, here's Good Ranchers saying, we're already providing you a great product that is worth every single cent. But let's give you a little bit something extra because, again, we want you to be well fed. We want you to, again, you need that protein. Tina's on a carnivore diet right now. Good Ranchers has been a blessing. It really is quality stuff. We've always said this before that everything that everybody we work with on advertisers, we want to make sure it's a good quality product, right? We make jokes about like Freedom Water, right? Like, no, good quality products. Good Ranchers is it. Wonderful people, wonderful company, great values, and an excellent product delivered right to your door. Goodranchers.com. Use promo code Nick. You're going to sign up for any one of those boxes. And you're going to be able to choose. Do you want the free chicken breasts, which are outstanding, by the way? Do you want the ground beef? Do you want the bacon? Do you want the salmon for a year? Just remember, the bacon, you can use it to wrap everything else. That's a good option. It's going to be goodranchers.com. Check that out. All right, listen. Christian, I mean, I know you got a couple more things. So why don't we summarize that? And then I'll kind of close out with some other thoughts here on how this applies to the U.S.
Yeah, so a couple things. First off, moral of the story, if you're going to stage a self-coup like Napoleon III did in the 1850s, where he was like, I'm tired of being president. I want to become emperor like my uncle. Make sure that you have your own supporters on your own side first before you do that, because he didn't even consult his own party.
Yeah, this would have been like Caesar going, "Hey, the Legion, you want to do this?" And Legion's like, "No, are you nuts? All right, let's do it anyway."
Yeah. I imagine if Caesar had crossed the Rubicon and then turned around and realized that his legion wasn't going to follow him.
Yeah.
Then like that is like
that's what Yoon just did.
And so like I actually sympathize with where he's coming from, not being a politician, being frustrated with the system, looking at the endemic corruption that's going on and the fact that the left lost an election and decided, well, we're just going to invalidate the election by impeaching you and then putting in the guy that you beat.
Yeah.
So that way we can continue with our utter destruction of the country, because it is the left that is promoting everything that's leading to the collapsing birth rate.
Yeah.
It's the like
we're about to see one of the quickest rises and declines of a country in human history.
Yes.
Where they rose literally out of the ashes in order to be this regional economic superpower, this innovative economy, just incredible, juxtaposed with a communist nation just to the north of them that did the exact opposite. Started off with better economic conditions and made it progressively worse over the decades. We're watching a country that did this meteoric rise, just like honestly an incredible story, and they're about to destroy it within a couple generations.
And I understand where Yoon's coming from, but this is the man that's not going to succeed him most likely. And I just want to go through this briefly. You know, talking about
this is the guy that is going to succeed him?
This is the guy that's likely going to succeed him. He's the head of the Democratic Party right now, and he's the leader of the opposition party. It's funny they're called the opposition party when they control the majority of the legislature, but that's how it's framed in South Korea. He's the head of the opposition party in their legislature. Even though they're in the majority, they're the opposition party because they don't control the presidency. You know, actually talking about the unraveling of the political system, he was almost assassinated himself in January.
Well, tell us.
So Lee Jae-myung is a very left-wing guy. I want to get to some examples here of how he was left-wing. So he ran in 2022 against Yoon. He narrowly lost. And To give you an idea of what he believes in, here's some examples. He runs on a policy platform close to the center left of the Democratic Party. He advocates for New Deal liberalism economically and respects the policies of Franklin Roosevelt. In 2021, he said, "We will change the graph of economic growth upward with a strong state-led economic revival policy. I'll learn from Roosevelt, who overcame the Great Depression with left-wing policy." That's a direct quote from him.
Yeah.
Here's some other examples. He asserts that slowdown in economic growth is related to unfairness and polarization in many areas of the economy. For example, gap between big monopolies and small and medium-sized enterprises, the difference between platforms and irregular workers, and inequalities in the real estate market. He goes on. It gets worse. I promise.
Universal basic income.
This strategy includes industrial policies for a quote Green New Deal and a digital transformation, education reforms to help people adapt to the new environment. His overall stance is close to social liberal and moderate progressivism, but also some economically liberal tendencies such as real estate tax cuts. He supports universal basic income, as you brought up. He wants a carbon tax, a land value tax. He pledged to distribute about 1 million South Korean won per year to every citizen. That's the equivalent of $900. Understand that the cost of living, though, is much lower. So when we say $900, doesn't sound like a lot, but like prices are not like.
I want someone to understand as well and we already said this is why I love our audience. Like Loyal to Law already said, I'll learn from Roosevelt, big red flag. You're absolutely right, but most Americans wouldn't even say that because in their textbooks, the New Deal saved us from the Great Depression. Social Security saved elderly people from dying in the streets. There's two elements within American history that people need to understand about where our own country took this turn, where now we're dealing with the residuals of it. And one of the biggest ones was the New Deal. And even somebody as big a Roosevelt sycophant as Arthur Schlesinger Jr. has come out and said, yeah, the New Deal did not help us recover from the Great Depression. New Deal policies were extended. It actually turned a combination of Hoover's policies and New Deal policies turned what would have been a temporary economic downturn that would have corrected within 3 years into a Great Depression. But since a politician was seen to be doing things, and since that politician picked enemies that in the minds of many people were legitimate enemies, and sometimes they were, and other times they were not, but they used the people within the system that the vast majority of the public blamed for things, and they used that as a stand-in for free market economics. Oh, free market economics is this industrialist or this shady businessman or whatever it was. And the end result is FDR put things in place and set a trend for putting things in place that Johnson would then build upon that are currently will be the source of major economic decline within the United States if they're not ultimately dealt with. And it was all done in the name of fairness. It was all done in the name of lifting up the lower economic classes and allowing them to rejoin the middle. And all of it led to inflationary monetary policy. It led to a massive welfare state that undermined the family. It led to various programs that actively discriminated against people. It led to all of that. And now this guy is talking about this is how they're going to save the problems currently within South Korea. And he's pointing to things that are true. They do have major government-backed monopolies, but that's the part they don't tell you. They're government-structured monopolies. So, so how are you going to solve that? Oh, with more government.
With a carbon tax.
With more government and a carbon tax and all of these things where it's this lofty rhetoric with policies that are going to make it more expensive to live, more expensive to own a business, more expensive to buy a home, more expensive to invest. But it all sounds so nice. And that's what, again, because of Yoon's action, because of his response, his reaction to their action, he is practically guaranteed that this is what's going to happen next. And this is the part that I mean.
Hang on. Can I go through just a few more of these? Because it gets worse. He wants to nationalize the banking industry. He wants government-backed loan. Here we go. Lee advocated for basic loans, which would allow any citizen to take out government loans up to 10 million won at an interest rate of around 3%, regardless of their credit status. He advocated for these government-backed loans to the public as a safer alternative to borrowing money from private money lenders. He actually is a supporter of free trade because he is a liberal.
Yeah.
He's not a hardcore like socialist.
Yeah.
He's more of a progressive type liberal. But He's very pro-feminist, very pro-LGBTQ, which are the two components of cultural Marxism within South Korea, because they don't have the other things that they can use. They're a homogenous society, and they were colonized themselves, so they can't use imperialism, they can't use racism, they can't use like the typical things that cultural Marxists latch on to when it comes to the U.S., Canada, Western Europe.
So it's got to be this LGBTQ
Gotta be gender
ideology,
stuff.
which, oh, by the way, are two, feminism and LGBTQ ideology and trans ideology are some of the things that will crush the birth rate even more.
Oh, the funny thing is that he wants to fix South Korea's birth rate problem by increasing immigration, which is a very polarizing issue because South Korea wants to remain Korean. So that's another issue where he's on the left on. He is not really super pro-US.
He calls China a strategic partner.
Yeah. He does support good trade relations with the U.S. because he's in favor of free trade, but that's probably where the positives end with him. To give you an idea, he's also militantly anti-Japanese. I want to read you a segment of the impeachment articles against Yoon. This is a paragraph of why they're impeaching him. It's not just because of the martial law. Look at what they put in here. In addition, under the guise of so-called value diplomacy, South Korea has neglected geopolitical balance, antagonizing North Korea, China, and Russia, adhering to a bizarre Japan-centered foreign policy. They're impeaching him for, quote, appointing Japan-oriented individuals to key government positions, thereby causing isolation in North Asia and triggering a crisis of war, abandoning its duty to protect national security and its people. They're literally going to impeach you not just for the martial law thing, but for appointing, quote, Japan-centered individuals to his government.
Yeah. Well, look, here's... So this is, again, we've given you an idea of kind of what got them to this point, what got Yoon to this point, why Yoon, one of the possible explanations for why Yoon did what he did, and what the response has been and what the response is almost likely to be. And what it means is that what might have been a break from something, a reaction from the Korean people based off of the frustration with some of the woke ideology, some of the lawfare, again, some of the very things that have motivated a lot of voters within the United States, led to somebody going in there and not knowing ultimately what they were doing or what they were facing. This is one of the reasons why, again, I think it has ended up being a blessing that Trump did not win re-election the first time. I actually think it's one of the greatest blessings of what will be the Trump presidency is that there was an intervening 4 years of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Because there were things that Trump didn't understand about the operational environment. As good as he was able to identify problems, he didn't identify the world that he was working in to try to fix them. Now I think he has a much clearer picture of it. And so now we're going into, and he's picking people that are not, I've had so many people question me, I'm like, what about the qualifications of Trump's picks? I'm like, first of all, I'm not going to be lectured on qualifications by a political party that thought picking a, cross-dressing luggage thief was a brave and stunning choice for a senior position of the Department of Energy. Okay, so I'm not taking any lectures from the Democratic Party on what they identify as properly credentialed and qualified cabinet level positions. What I want is not somebody with all of the credentials that were issued by the very institutions which despise us and the very organizations we're either trying to reform or get rid of. I want people who are competent, who use critical thinking, who are patriotic, and who recognize the massive problem that the federal bureaucracy presents, and who will relentlessly go in there and demand from those agencies to give the information, to participate in the audits, so that we can use things like DOGE to determine where there's corruption, where there's inefficiency, and where we can just come to the conclusion that, guess what? It's not that the issue this organization is trying to address doesn't exist. It's that it doesn't belong at the federal government. It can be true that there is a legitimate problem that we need to address, and also true that it's not the business of the federal government. It can be true that we do need to marshal resources in order to try to address a particular thing, and also be true that a particular agency has lost its way and is no longer doing that effectively. That's the sort of thing that we need right now. And I am so grateful. I am so grateful that I think the people Trump is picking right now, right, have that sort of mindset. They're not going into these agencies and whatnot in order to advocate on behalf of the agency. They're going in there to advocate on behalf of us. And that's what's been desperately missing. Because there is such a thing as agency capture, where all of a sudden you're now picked to run something. And your mindset is, well, I've got to run it efficiently. Well, how do I run it efficiently? Well, I talk to the people that are currently there and I ask them how operations are done. And lo and behold, who are the people closest to that cabinet level position? The same unelected bureaucrats that don't want any change and want to hold on to their power. And I think we're picking people that are going to go in there and say, look, I understand the necessity of the Department of Defense. I understand the necessity of the Department of Justice. I understand the necessity of the Department of State, but I don't like the way you've been running it. I don't like the ideological capture that has taken place. And my job is not to make your job easier. It's to once again ensure that this organization, this agency, this bureau, this department operates within the constitutional framework for which it was created. And if there is no constitutional justification for its existence, then it goes away. And I don't think we would have got that if he would have won re-election. I don't think we would have got it. There was a number of reactions there that were bad, but they weren't catastrophic. And now I think we're going into this situation so much smarter than we would have in just a second consecutive Trump term. And so the key that we have right now, and this is going to be so important. I got invited to go up and actually talk with U.S. senators earlier this week. And we were talking about how we discuss some of these issues. We were talking about how do we effectively go out there. And one of the things that was so encouraging is the number of people in positions of power that realize that the legacy media is never going to be their friend. That what we really need is for people to go out there and explain what is going on, not through the lens of the Washington Post or MSNBC. They can still get out there and report their stories, fine. But they don't get to have a monopoly on the messaging anymore. And we should stop having our people treat them as if they're the only way to get the message out anymore. There is a whole host of other outlets now that are able to help craft this message on what is actually going on, not for the purposes of manipulating the process, but for the purposes of saying, look, we understand that if you're going to cut the size of the federal government, it means that you're going to lose certain federal employees. That doesn't mean the money just disappears. It means now it can be used on either legitimate functions of government or, even better yet, given back to the taxpayers so they can use it on the things they want to prioritize. And we need to be able to tell that story. And what's going to happen over the next 2 years especially is they're going to set up one baited ambush after the other, one frustrating thing after the next. And there's going to be some things where we are going to have to move. We are going to have to push back and push back hard. But what everyone needs to understand is the moment that you push back in such a way that is legitimately immoral or legitimately takes away the popular support you ultimately need in order to make this thing successful, you're not being the braver one. You are setting us up for failure long term. We need people who are brave. We need people who are smart. And when I look at some of the people that he's picking, I'm seeing people that I genuinely believe are brave and they're smart. They are willing to have the difficult conversations. They are willing to face the things that they know are going to come after them in order to actually achieve genuine reform. The various people that are conservative in name only, Republican in name only, they're going to reveal themselves. But we have to make sure that we are smart and strategic in everything that we do, because I do believe that we have this 2-year period of time that is going to be so consequential to the next 2 decades if we do it right. And that doesn't mean being weak. That doesn't mean not willing to push limits. Doesn't mean any of that. We're going to have to do a lot of that. And we're going to have to make good arguments for why it needs to be done. But we're also going to have to understand at the end of the day, what we're ultimately trying to achieve is the preservation of our republic. That's what I want. I think the founders gave us something that was truly brilliant, truly brilliant. And I want to preserve it. And I want to fight alongside people that want to preserve it. But I want to do it wisely, because I'll tell you this. I know what it is to go and fight wars that were ill-considered, ill-supported, and ill-run. And it sucks. Let's fight it the right way this time. Well, we hope that was a helpful explanation of what's going on and why ultimately I do believe it's relevant. I want to thank Christian for a lot of the work that he did on tracking down the links, the articles, the information to be able to try to give this like a good comprehensive overview and to draw the relevance with what we're seeing, not just in the United States, but really in the West right now, because the same battle is going on in a lot of places and it's being fought with varying degrees of success. I really do think that we are on the potential of watching the pendulum swing back. And the question is how do we guide that swing to get it to where we want to go and not end up in a bait and ambush for the political left? Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We will see you next episode.